The contract was sitting on the table between them like a loaded pistol. 30 pounds for 3 months. That was the price of pretending to love a man she had never met. Lenora Graves stared at the neat black ink and thought, this is what desperation looks like when it wears a gentleman's handwriting. But that moment came later. This is how it began. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight when the letter arrived. Not the polite, misting kind of rain that London liked to pretend was atmospheric, but the brutal, hammering sort that turned streets into rivers and made the walls of their cheap-side lodgings weep with damp. Lenora was kneeling on the kitchen floor, pressing rags against the gap beneath the back door, where brown water crept in with quiet persistence, when her brother Soren appeared in the doorway, holding an envelope like it might bite him. "It's from Hewitt Dalton," he said. Lenora sat back on her heels. Her knees ached. Her hands were raw. She was 23 years old, and she felt ancient. "What does he want?" "He says there's work, real work, not like last time." Soren had the decency to look ashamed. Last time had involved a forged letter of introduction, a borrowed horse, and a constable who was faster than either of them had anticipated. A nobleman needs someone, a woman, someone presentable who can play a part for the season. Hewitt says the pay is extraordinary. Hewitt says a great many things. Lenora, please. Soren crossed the kitchen and crouched beside her, his voice dropping. Mother's cough is worse. The apothecary won't extend credit again. And the landlord sent another notice this morning. If we don't find 30 pounds by the end of the month, we're out. She knew all of this. She lived inside the mathematics of their poverty every single day, counting pennies the way other women counted dance steps. Their father had been a silk merchant, prosperous and proud, until his partner absconded with the accounts and left him holding debts that ate everything. The shop, the house in Holborn, the future Lenora had imagined for herself. He hadn't died, but something in him had. The man who'd built an empire from bolts of cloth now sat in a chair by the window and stared at nothing, speaking only when spoken to, eating only when food was placed before him. Now she and Soren and their mother, and the ghost of their father, occupied 3 rooms above a chandler's shop and called it surviving. "What kind of part?" she asked. He didn't say exactly, just that she'd need to be educated, well-spoken, able to move in society without embarrassing anyone. Soren paused. He asked for you specifically. How flattering. Will you at least meet the man, hear what he's offering? She should have said no. Every sensible instinct she possessed was screaming at her to refuse, to find another way, to take in more mending or seek a governess position through proper channels. But proper channels took months, and they had weeks, perhaps days. "Where?" she said. "A solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn, tomorrow at noon." The solicitor's office smelled of dust and ambition. Lenora wore her best dress, which was also her only good dress. Dove gray wool, with careful mending at the cuffs that she hoped wouldn't be noticed. She had pinned her dark auburn hair beneath a modest bonnet and rehearsed 15 different ways to say no politely because she fully intended to hear this offer and walk away from it. Then he walked in. He was not what she expected. She had imagined someone old, portly, desperate in the way of aging lords who needed decorative wives for appearances. Instead, the man who entered the room was perhaps 30, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that swept over her once with the clinical precision of someone appraising an investment. His clothes were immaculate, his bearing rigid, and when he sat down across from her, he did not smile. "Miss Graves," he said. His voice was low, controlled, stripped of warmth. "I'm told you're intelligent, discreet, and currently in need of money. Is that accurate?" "I'm told you need a woman to pretend something for you," Lenora replied evenly, Is that accurate? His mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something closer to acknowledgement. My name is Ashworth Colborne. I am the Marquess of Trevane. And what I need, Miss Graves, is a bride. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water of a lake. A temporary bride, he continued, as if proposing a business arrangement, no different from hiring a clerk. For the duration of the London season, 3 months, perhaps 4, you would be presented as my betrothed, attend events at my side, reside in my household, and convince society that our attachment is genuine. And why, Lenora said carefully, would a marquess need to purchase a fiancé? Something flickered behind his dark eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself. He leaned back in his chair and studied her with an expression that suggested he was deciding how much truth she deserved. Because, Ashworth said, I'm being hunted. The word choice was deliberate. Not pursued, not courted. Hunted. My father died 7 months ago. Since then, every eligible woman in London, and a considerable number from the countryside, has been presented to me, paraded before me, thrust into my path at every conceivable opportunity. I have received 43 letters of introduction, 17 invitations to private suppers, and one rather alarming proposal delivered by a woman who climbed into my carriage while it was stopped in traffic. Lenora blinked. Climbed into your carriage? Through the window. He said it flatly, as if women launching themselves through carriage windows were merely another administrative inconvenience. My aunt, Lady Hargrove, is the architect of most of this. She's determined to see me married before the season ends. She has a particular candidate in mind, a Miss Phaedra Ashwell, daughter of the Earl of Comberford. Impeccable lineage, considerable fortune, absolutely no original thought in her head. And you don't want to marry her. I don't want to marry anyone. The words came out flat, final, like a door closing. Not now, possibly not ever. But my aunt won't accept that. She's already arranged a house party at Trevane Park next month, where she intends to maneuver me into a compromising situation with Miss Ashwell. She's done this before. She's very skilled at it. Lenora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty office. She'd engineer a scandal to force a marriage? She'd call it protecting the family legacy. The Colborne title has been unbroken for 400 years. I'm the last of the line. In her mind, my refusal to marry isn't stubbornness. It's treason against the blood. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice dropping. If I arrive at the season already betrothed, she can't force another match. She'll rage, she'll scheme, but she can't overturn an existing engagement without creating the very scandal she's trying to avoid. So you need a shield. I need a performance. 3 months of convincing behavior. You attend the balls, the dinners, the garden parties. You smile, you converse, you act besotted. At the end of the season, we announce that we've mutually decided we don't suit. You leave with a generous settlement. I leave with my freedom. Nobody gets hurt. Nobody gets hurt. It sounded so simple when he said it. Clean, clinical, bloodless, like surgery performed by a man who had never seen what happened when the patient bled. £30, he said, pushing a document across the table. Paid in full at the conclusion of the arrangement, plus a wardrobe allowance, living expenses, and a letter of reference upon completion. £30. It was more money than Lenora had seen in 2 years. It was the apothecary's bill, the back rent, her mother's medicine, Soren's debts. All of it cleared in a single stroke. It was breathing room. It was survival. But it was also a lie. A vast, elaborate, dangerous lie told to the most powerful people in England. And if it unraveled, when it unraveled, Lenora would be the one left holding the wreckage, while the Marquis of Trevane retreated behind his title and his fortune, and his 400 years of unbroken lineage. "What happens if we're discovered?" she asked. "We won't be." "That's not an answer." He regarded her with something that might have been the earliest stirring of respect. "If we're discovered, I will take full responsibility. You'll be portrayed as an innocent party who was misled. No blame will attach to your name. Forgive me, my lord, but your word is currently the promise of a stranger who wants to buy 3 months of my life. I'll need more than that." Ashworth's jaw tightened. He was not, she suspected, a man who was challenged often. "What do you want?" "I want the 30 pounds divided. Half now, half upon completion. If you dismiss me early, or the arrangement collapses through no fault of mine, I keep what's been paid." "That's not standard." "There is nothing standard about any of this." Lenora held his gaze without flinching. "You've had 43 letters of introduction. You chose to sit across from a merchant's daughter in a solicitor's office. That tells me your options for this particular scheme are limited. So let's negotiate honestly, my lord, because I think you need me rather more than I need you." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Ashworth did something unexpected. He laughed. It was brief, startled, almost unwilling, as if the sound had escaped before he could trap it. 15 now, he said. 15 upon completion. And if it collapses, you keep whatever has been paid, plus a bonus of 5 pounds for your trouble. Agreed? Lenora looked at the contract. She thought of her mother's cough, the landlord's notice, the water creeping under the kitchen door. She thought of her father sitting silent by the window, a man who had trusted a partner and lost everything. "One more condition," she said. "I want to know who I'm deceiving." Ashworth frowned. "I've told you. Society at large, my aunt, not the audience, the players. I need to know every person who matters in your world, who your aunt's allies are, who the rivals will be, who will be watching me closest and looking hardest for cracks. If I'm going to walk into a lion's den, I need a map of the teeth." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled his chair closer to the table and began. Lady Hargrove, his aunt, was his father's sister, and the true power behind the Colborne family. She had married well, outlived her husband, and redirected all her considerable energy into managing the family legacy. She was intelligent, ruthless, and had raised Ashworth and his younger sister after their mother's death, a sacrifice she considered a debt, repayable only through obedience. Miss Phaedra Ashwell was Lady Hargrove's chosen candidate, beautiful, accomplished, and trained from birth for exactly this kind of match. Her father, the Earl of Comberford, was an old ally of the Colborne family. The union had been discussed informally for years, and Phaedra herself had been led to believe it was a certainty. She would not yield her position gracefully. And then there was Ashworth's sister. "Meridia is 19, Ashworth said, and something in his voice changed when he spoke her name. Softened fractionally, lost its clinical edge. "She's been living with our aunt since father's death. She writes to me constantly, asking to come to London, asking when things will be normal again. Our aunt uses her as leverage. If I cooperate with her plans, Meridia gets a proper debut. If I resist, Meridia stays in the country, invisible. Your aunt holds your sister hostage. My aunt would call it guidance. Your aunt sounds monstrous. My aunt is practical. There's a difference, though sometimes a narrow one." He stood, crossing to the window of the solicitor's office. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight pushed through the clouds like an apology. "If this works, if we are convincing, my aunt will have no choice but to abandon the Ashwell match. Once a public engagement exists, she can't undermine it without damaging the family reputation she's devoted her life to protecting. And once the pressure lifts, I can bring Meridia to London properly, on my terms. Lenora heard what he wasn't saying. This wasn't just about avoiding marriage. It was about rescuing his sister from a woman who wielded love like a weapon. "When do we begin?" she asked. "Tomorrow evening. There's a reception at Guildford House. Lord and Lady Marchbanks host it annually to open the season. Everyone who matters will be there, including my aunt and Miss Ashwell. They don't know about you yet. No one does." "And you plan to simply arrive with a fiancé no one has heard of?" "I plan to arrive with a woman who will be so composed, so articulate, and so utterly convincing that no one will dare question the attachment until it's too late to matter. That's a great deal of faith to place in someone you met an hour ago." "I'm not placing faith, Miss Graves. I'm placing a bet." His dark eyes held hers. "Don't make me regret it." Lenora returned to Cheapside with £15 in her reticule and the sensation of having stepped off a cliff. She told her mother she'd secured a position as a companion to a nobleman's sister. Not entirely a lie, not remotely the truth. Her mother wept with relief and immediately began planning how to stretch the money across every outstanding debt. Soren watched her with narrowed eyes. "What's the real arrangement?" "The one I just described." "Lenora!" "Leave it, Soren. For once in your life, just accept that something is working and don't try to improve it." He let it go, but she could see the questions banking behind his eyes like embers. Soren always wanted to know the angles, not dishonest, but perpetually convinced that the next clever move would fix everything. The dress arrived at dawn, deep ivory silk edged with delicate copper embroidery, along with gloves, stockings, and slippers that fit as if they'd been made for her feet. A note in unfamiliar handwriting read, "Wear your hair up. No bonnet. The Colborne betrothal ring will be provided upon arrival." She dressed in silence while the house slept, twisted her auburn hair into the best arrangement she could manage without a maid, and examined herself in the small, spotted mirror above the washstand. She looked like someone she didn't recognize. The carriage he sent was plain black and unmarked, discreet enough for Cheapside, but lined with velvet inside. They rolled through London as the last light bled from the sky. Ashworth was waiting outside Guildford House. He looked immaculate in dark evening clothes, his expression as controlled as it had been in the solicitor's office, but his eyes tracked her as she stepped down from the carriage, and for one unguarded moment, she saw surprise register on his face. "You look—" He stopped, reset. "The dress fits well." "You were going to say something else." "I was going to say you look convincing, which is what matters." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a square-cut sapphire flanked by small diamonds, set in old gold. "This was my mother's. It will be recognized. When people see it on your hand, they'll understand. This is serious." Lenora's breath caught. "Your mother's ring?" "It's the most efficient way to establish credibility." His voice was flat, practical, but his fingers hesitated for just a moment before he placed the ring in her palm. "It's a prop, Miss Graves. Nothing more." She slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which felt like an omen she didn't want to examine. "Remember," Ashworth said as they approached the doors, "you are Lenora Graves, daughter of a silk merchant in Holborn. Your father had connections to the Colborne family through trade. We met at my sister's urging and have been corresponding privately for several months. The engagement is recent. You are not intimidated, you are not performing, and you are not available for interrogation. I will handle the questions. You simply need to exist beside me and look as though you chose to be there. And if someone asks me a direct question, answer it honestly wherever possible. Lies are harder to maintain than truths. Your background is modest, but respectable. There's no shame in it, and anyone who suggests otherwise reveals their own character, not yours." It was, unexpectedly, the most reassuring thing he could have said. The doors opened, and light and noise and the scent of hothouse flowers poured over them like a wave. Hundreds of candles blazed from chandeliers. Laughter and music tangled together in the warm air. Everywhere Lenora looked, she saw silk and diamonds and the effortless confidence of people who had never once wondered whether they could afford new boots. Ashworth offered his arm. His expression was a mask of calm authority, but she felt the tension in his muscles, the coiled readiness of a man walking into battle. She took his arm, lifted her chin, and stepped into the light. They made it approximately 12 steps before the first strike came. Ashworth. A woman's voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. What a delightful surprise. Lady Hargrove materialized from the crowd, as if she'd been waiting, and knowing what Lenora now knew about this woman, she probably had been. She was perhaps 60, slender as a reed, with silver hair swept into an elaborate arrangement, and pale blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore dark violet and enough amethysts to fund a small hospital. Her gaze landed on Lenora's hand, on the ring, on the sapphire that had once belonged to her brother's wife. The temperature around them dropped 10 degrees. "Aunt Hargrove," Ashworth said, his voice perfectly steady, "allow me to introduce Miss Lenora Graves, my fiancée." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt like 3 centuries. Then Lady Hargrove smiled. It was the most dangerous smile Lenora had ever seen. Warm on the surface, glacial underneath, promising nothing good. "How wonderful," she said softly. "And what a remarkable surprise. I had no idea you were even acquainted with anyone named Graves." Her eyes moved to Lenora's face, cataloging every detail with surgical precision. "Tell me, dear, where exactly did you come from?" Lenora felt the weight of every gaze in the room turning toward them. She felt Ashworth's arm tense beneath her hand. She felt the sapphire ring pressing against her finger like a brand. She met Lady Hargrove's eyes and smiled back. "Holborn, your ladyship. Though I suspect that's not really what you're asking." Lady Hargrove did not flinch. She absorbed Lenora's words the way a duelist absorbs the first strike, acknowledging the blow, already calculating the next. Around them, the reception continued, but a small radius of silence had opened, guests pretending not to listen while listening intently. "Holborn," Lady Hargrove repeated, tasting the word. "How resourceful of you, Ashworth. A merchant's daughter." She turned to her nephew with a smile that could have frosted glass. "Your father would have been fascinated." "My father would have approved," Ashworth replied, his hand covering Lenora's where it rested on his arm. The gesture was possessive, deliberate, and entirely for the audience. He valued character over pedigree. Your father valued a great many things that proved impractical. Lady Hargrove's gaze returned to Lenora, lingering on the sapphire ring. "That was my brother's wife's ring. Did he tell you that?" "He did, your ladyship." "And you weren't troubled by wearing a dead woman's ring to secure a living man's title?" The cruelty was precise, surgical, designed to make Lenora stumble in front of the watching crowd. She felt the blood drain from her face, but kept her voice level. "I was honored that Lord Trevane trusted me with something so precious. It speaks to the depth of his regard." A small sound from somewhere behind Lady Hargrove, a stifled gasp, or perhaps a laugh. Lenora couldn't tell. But Ashworth's hand pressed against hers, a silent signal. "Hold steady. We shall discuss this further in private," Lady Hargrove said, her smile hardening into something that was no longer pretending to be pleasant. "Tomorrow. You will both come to Hargrove House for tea. 2 o'clock. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. She swept away, and the crowd parted for her like water around the prow of a warship. Lenora exhaled. Her hands were trembling. That was well done, Ashworth murmured. That was terrifying. Those are often the same thing. He steered her deeper into the reception, his stride unhurried, his expression betraying nothing. The worst is over. She's been surprised, and she hates surprises. Tomorrow she'll be prepared, and that will be harder. But tonight, we've established the fact of our engagement. That's what mattered. They spent the next 2 hours circulating. Ashworth introduced her to lords and ladies, whose names blurred together. She smiled, conversed, and answered questions about Holborn with carefully rehearsed truthfulness. Yes, her father had been in the silk trade. Yes, the family had faced difficulties. No, she wasn't embarrassed. Why should she be? It was exhausting. But she held. Near midnight, as the crowd began to thin, a young woman in pale gold appeared at Ashworth's elbow. She was small and dark-haired, with the same sharp cheekbones as Ashworth, but none of his severity. Her brown eyes were enormous and bright with barely contained emotion. "You absolute wretch," she whispered fiercely. "You didn't tell me." Ashworth's entire demeanor shifted. The rigidity softened. His hand dropped from Lenora's arm as he turned to his sister, with something approaching tenderness. "Meridia, I didn't know Aunt Hargrove was bringing you tonight." She wasn't going to. But when your little announcement reached the drawing room, she decided I needed to see this disaster for myself. Meridia's gaze swung to Lenora, sharp and searching. "You're her? The fiancé nobody knew about?" "Lenora Graves," she said, offering her hand. Meridia took it, but didn't shake. She held it, studying Lenora's face with an intensity that reminded her uncomfortably of Lady Hargrove. Then something shifted in the girl's expression. Suspicion, giving way to curiosity, then to something warmer. "You're real," Meridia said quietly. "You're actually real. You're not one of Aunt Hargrove's creatures. Definitely not. And you're marrying my brother? Willingly. Very willingly." The lie came out smooth. Too smooth. Lenora felt a pang of guilt she hadn't expected. Meridia's face broke into a grin so wide it transformed her entirely. "Then you must come stay with us, at Colborne House. I've been trapped in the country for months, with nothing but Aunt Hargrove's opinions and needlework for company. Please say you'll come. Please. I'll go mad otherwise." "Meridia," Ashworth began. "She's your fiancée. She should be staying with the family. Even Aunt Hargrove can't argue with that." Meridia squeezed Lenora's hands. "Say yes. I'm begging." Lenora looked at Ashworth. His expression was carefully neutral, but she saw something underneath it. A flicker of hope, quickly suppressed. If she moved into Colborne House, the charade would deepen. The performance would become daily, hourly, constant. There would be no retreat to Cheapside at the end of each evening to shed the mask and breathe. But Meridia's eyes were bright with a loneliness Lenora recognized in her own reflection. "I'd be delighted," she said. Ashworth found her alone in the cloakroom 20 minutes later, while she waited for her carriage. "You didn't have to agree to that," he said. "Your sister needs a friend more than she needs a scheme." His expression hardened. "I'm aware of what my sister needs." "Then you're aware that keeping her isolated in the country, while your aunt uses her as a bargaining chip, is cruelty, however practical it might be." The words were sharper than she'd intended. Ashworth's eyes darkened, and for a moment she thought he'd snap at her. Instead, he was quiet for several long seconds. "I've been trying to get her to London for months," he said finally, his voice stripped of its usual control. "Every request goes through my aunt. Every plan requires her approval. She holds Meridia's debut, her social standing, her entire future as leverage against me. If I defy her openly, Meridia suffers. That's the calculation I live inside, Miss Graves, every single day. The rawness in his voice caught Lenora off guard. This wasn't the cold, clinical man from the solicitor's office. This was a brother suffocating under an impossible choice. "Then let me help," she said quietly. "Not as your fake fiancé, as someone who understands what it feels like to watch someone you love be used as currency." He studied her face for a long time. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Graves. Is that a good thing? I haven't decided yet." But the ghost of something, not quite a smile, but its distant cousin, crossed his face as her carriage arrived. She climbed in with his mother's sapphire still on her finger, and the unsettling realization that this arrangement was already becoming something she hadn't planned for. Colborne House stood on the north side of Grosvenor Square, like a monument to the certainty of old wealth. Lenora arrived the following morning with one trunk containing everything she owned. The trunk looked pitiful, sitting in the marble entrance hall, dwarfed by the soaring ceiling and the portraits of Colborne ancestors stretching back centuries. A housekeeper named Mrs. Caulfield greeted her with brisk efficiency and no visible judgment. "The blue rooms have been prepared, miss. His lordship thought you'd prefer the east wing. The morning light is quite pleasant." The blue rooms turned out to be a suite larger than Lenora's entire home, a bedroom with a four-poster bed hung in soft blue damask, a sitting room with its own fireplace and writing desk, a dressing room with a wardrobe that could have housed a family of 4. The windows looked out over a private garden where early roses were beginning to bloom. Lenora stood in the center of the bedroom and pressed her palms against her thighs to stop them trembling. This was temporary, a stage set, 3 months, and then she'd fold it all up and walk back to her real life carrying 30 pounds and whatever references she could gather. But the sheets were Egyptian cotton, and the fireplace was already lit, and there were fresh flowers on the writing desk, white camellias, which she'd never been able to afford. A knock at the door startled her. "Miss Graves, I'm Dorrit. His lordship assigned me as your lady's maid." The girl who entered was perhaps 18, freckled and bright-eyed, with red gold hair tucked under a starched cap. She carried a tea tray balanced with practiced ease. "I brought breakfast. Mrs. Caulfield said you hadn't eaten, and it's a long time until luncheon." "That's very thoughtful. Thank you." Dorrit set the tray down and began unpacking Lenora's trunk with gentle hands. She didn't comment on the modest contents, the mended stockings, and the single pair of evening gloves. She simply arranged everything as if it were the finest trousseau in England. "Are these your only things, miss?" she asked carefully. "For now." "Well, Lady Meridia mentioned a fitting with Madame Hartshorn this afternoon. I expect you'll have plenty more soon enough." Dorrit smiled shyly. "If you don't mind my saying, miss, the house has been dreadful quiet since his old lordship passed. Lady Meridia only arrived last week, and his lordship barely leaves his study. It's nice to have someone new." Lenora sipped the tea, the best she'd ever tasted, and wondered how many people in this house were lonely. Meridia appeared before the tea was cold, bursting through the door with the energy of someone who had been bottled up for months and was finally uncorked. "You're here. Finally. I've already written to Madame Hartshorn. She's expecting us at 3. We need morning dresses, walking dresses, at least 4 evening gowns, and something extraordinary for the Pemberton Ball. That's in 10 days, and it's the event of the season, and everyone will be watching us. Meridia, I can't possibly accept. You're Ashworth's fiancé. You must dress the part. He's already approved the account." Meridia dropped onto the settee and pulled her feet up beneath her, looking suddenly very young. "Besides, if Aunt Hargrove sees you in anything less than perfection, She'll use it as proof that you're unsuitable. Every thread you wear is ammunition, Lenora. I learned that the hard way. There was a shadow behind the brightness, a bruise that Meridia covered with energy, and chatter the way other women covered them with powder. Lenora recognized it because she did the same thing. What was it like? Lenora asked carefully. Living with your aunt. Meridia's smile dimmed. Controlled. Everything had a purpose. The books I read, the people I saw, the accomplishments I practiced. It was all designed to make me into the perfect ornament for some future husband's drawing room. She's not cruel, exactly. She never raised her voice. She just erased anything that didn't fit her plan. Your brother said she held your debut as leverage. She held everything as leverage. My entire life was conditional. Behave and you'll be rewarded. Resist and you'll be forgotten. She kept me in Wiltshire for 6 months while London happened without me. Meridia's voice cracked slightly. Ashworth tried to bring me here, but she blocked every attempt, said I wasn't ready. The truth is, she knew that if I were here, I'd be harder to control. Lenora reached across and took the girl's hand. You're here now. Because of you. Meridia squeezed back. Because Ashworth finally did something Aunt Hargrove didn't expect. She's furious, but she can't send me back without admitting she's lost control, and Lady Hargrove never admits defeat. The fitting at Madame Hartshorn's atelier was a revolution in silk. The modiste was a sharp-eyed Frenchwoman who circled Lenora with pins bristling from her wrist like quills, murmuring about bone structure and coloring with the intensity of a sculptor assessing marble. The copper tones with your hair, magnificent. We build the wardrobe around warmth, ivory, amber, sage, deep bronze for evening. No pastels. Pastels would wash you out and make you forgettable. You cannot afford to be forgettable. Meridia supervised with fierce enthusiasm, vetoing anything she deemed too safe or too modest. You're marrying a marquess, not entering a convent. Show some collarbone. By the time they left, Lenora's head was spinning with fabric samples and delivery dates, and the staggering knowledge that more money had been spent on her wardrobe in a single afternoon than her family had earned in the past year. They returned to Colborne House to find Ashworth in the entrance hall, clearly waiting. The tea with my aunt is in 2 hours, he said without preamble. We need to prepare. Meridia's brightness flickered. Must I come? No. This is between Miss Graves, myself, and Aunt Hargrove. Relief washed across Meridia's face. She pressed Lenora's hand once, courage, and disappeared upstairs. Ashworth led Lenora to the library, a magnificent room, floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, leather armchairs, a globe in the corner, old enough to show countries that no longer existed. My aunt will try to break you this afternoon, he said. She'll probe your background, test your composure, look for inconsistencies. She's had 24 hours to prepare, and Lady Hargrove with preparation time is formidable. Questions about your father's business, the timeline of our supposed courtship. She'll want dates and specifics that can be verified or disproven. Then we need the truth, wherever possible, wrapped around a single necessary lie. That we're in love. He said the words clinically. Everything else should be accurate. The more truth in the frame, the harder it is to crack. They spent an hour constructing the narrative. They'd met through a mutual acquaintance connected to Ashworth's late father's solicitor. They'd corresponded for 3 months. The engagement was private because Ashworth wanted to spare Lenora the pressure of public scrutiny. I'm not ashamed of who I am. No. He looked at her, and for a moment the clinical mask slipped. No, I don't think you are. That might be the most remarkable thing about you. Hargrove House was a fortress disguised as a townhouse. A butler with the demeanor of a palace guard admitted them and led them to a drawing room so perfectly appointed it looked like a painting rather than a place where anyone actually lived. Lady Hargrove was waiting in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. Tea things were arranged beside her, fine porcelain, silver, a plate of delicate cakes that Lenora suspected no one was expected to eat. "Sit," Lady Hargrove said. Not "please sit," not "do sit down," just the command, stripped bare. They sat. Ashworth chose the settee, and Lenora sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. The proximity was strategic. Lady Hargrove noted it with a flicker of her pale eyes. "I'll dispense with pleasantries," she said. "I spent this morning making inquiries. Arthur Graves, silk merchant, dissolved his business following the embezzlement of his partner. The family relocated to Cheapside. Mrs. Graves takes in mending. The son has accumulated debts with at least 4 establishments. The daughter, her gaze fixed on Lenora, has been seeking employment as a governess without success for 18 months. Every word was a blade, precisely placed. Lenora felt her face heat, but she kept her hand still in her lap. "You're thorough, your ladyship." "I'm protective. There's a difference." Lady Hargrove poured tea with movements so controlled they might have been mechanical. "My nephew is the Marquis of Trevane. His estate encompasses 11,000 acres, and an income that would make most men delirious. He is also the last of his line. The woman he marries will bear the next Colborne heir and represent 4 centuries of legacy." She set down the teapot and looked at Lenora with cold assessment. "Explain to me, Miss Graves, why that woman should be you." Lenora opened her mouth, but Ashworth spoke first. "She doesn't need to justify herself to you. She does if she intends to survive in this world." Lady Hargrove's voice was sharp. "I'm not your enemy, Ashworth, though I know you believe otherwise. I'm the only person in this room thinking clearly. Infatuation fades. Novelty wears thin. When the excitement of defying me has passed, you'll be left with the consequences of a reckless choice, and so will she. My choice is not reckless. Your choice is barely 2 months old. You've known this girl since... when? January? February? March," Lenora said quietly. Lady Hargrove turned to her. "March. 2 months. And in 2 months, you've decided to bind yourself to a man whose world you cannot possibly understand. With respect, your ladyship, I understand more than you assume. Do you? Do you understand what it means to manage a household with 40 servants? To host a dinner for a cabinet minister? To navigate a scandal without flinching? To bury a husband and carry on as if your heart hasn't been ripped from your chest because the family name requires it?" The last question broke through Lady Hargrove's composure for just a moment. Lenora saw it. A crack in the armor, pain leaking through like light through a fracture. This woman had buried her own husband, had carried on, had built this fortress of control because the alternative was collapse. "No," Lenora said. "I don't understand all of that. Not yet. But I understand loss. I understand watching someone you love be diminished by circumstances beyond their control. I understand carrying a family when everything that held it together has been taken away." Lady Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "Pretty words. Honest ones. My father built everything from nothing, and when it was stolen from him, he didn't have a title or an estate or a legacy to fall back on. He had nothing but his family, and watching him break under that weight taught me something your nephew's world never could. What it means to survive when there's no safety net beneath you." The room was very quiet. Ashworth sat motionless beside her, and she could feel his attention like heat. "You're bold," Lady Hargrove said finally. "Recklessly bold. The kind of bold that gets young women destroyed in society. Or the kind that earns respect from women who've survived it. For a long, suspended moment, Lady Hargrove simply looked at her. Then she did something Lenora did not expect. She turned to Ashworth. "Leave us." Ashworth tensed. "Aunt Hargrove." "Leave us. I wish to speak with Miss Graves alone." He looked at Lenora. She nodded, a tiny motion, but enough. He stood, his reluctance visible in every rigid line of his body, and left the room. The door clicked shut behind him. Lady Hargrove set aside her teacup and leaned forward, and suddenly she looked not like a general, but like a woman carrying a weight she'd never been allowed to set down. "Now then," she said, "without the audience, without my nephew's protective hovering, tell me the truth. The truth about what? About why you're really here. Because I've watched a great many women orbit Ashworth since his father died, and not one of them had the nerve to look me in the eye and talk about survival. Gold diggers simper, social climbers flatter. You did neither. So either you're extraordinarily well-trained, or you're something I haven't encountered before." Lenora's heart hammered. This was the moment where the charade could crack open, where one wrong word would expose the contract, the 30 pounds, the entire mercenary architecture of this arrangement. "I'm here because your nephew asked me to be," she said carefully, "and because I believe I can be good for him." Good for him. Lady Hargrove tasted the phrase. My brother, Ashworth's father, died believing he'd prepared his son for everything, but he hadn't prepared him for grief. Ashworth has been performing his duties admirably since the funeral. The estates are managed, the tenants are satisfied, Parliament receives his attendance. But he's not present. He goes through the motions of living without actually inhabiting his own life. Lenora recognized the description. It was the same thing she'd seen in her own father. "He needs someone who will refuse to let him disappear into duty," Lady Hargrove continued. "Someone who will challenge him, irritate him, force him to feel something beyond obligation. Miss Ashwell would never do that. She'd agree with everything he said, and embroider quietly while he calcified. Then why push the match? Because a suitable match was safe, predictable, controllable." Lady Hargrove stood and moved to the window. "After my husband died, I chose control over everything else. I controlled my household, my family, my grief. Because if I controlled enough, nothing could hurt me again." She turned back, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears in a woman who permitted tears. "I was wrong. Control didn't prevent pain. It simply redistributed it to the people I claimed to love. Meridia spent 6 months alone in the country because I couldn't bear to lose influence over her future. Ashworth is marrying a stranger to escape me." Her voice cracked. "I've become the thing I was trying to protect them from." Lenora didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound hollow. "I don't trust you, Miss Graves," Lady Hargrove said, composure restored with visible effort. "I don't know you, and trust is earned, not assumed. But I recognize something in you that I haven't seen in the parade of suitable women I've thrown at my nephew." "What's that?" "Spine. Real spine, not the performative kind that crumbles under pressure." She crossed back to her chair. "I won't support this engagement publicly. Not yet. But I won't oppose it either. You'll have the season to prove yourself. And Meridia?" Lady Hargrove's expression shifted. Surprise, and something softer. "What about Meridia?" "She stays in London. She gets her debut. She's free to make her own choices without conditions attached. That's not negotiable." The silence stretched between them, taut as wire. Then Lady Hargrove laughed, a short, startled sound, rusty with disuse. "You're negotiating with me in my own drawing room. Your nephew loves his sister. Freeing her would mean more to him than anything I could offer. If you want to show him you've changed, start there." Lady Hargrove studied her for a long, unreadable moment. Then she nodded once. Meridia stays. She'll have her season. Her eyes hardened again. But hear me clearly, Miss Graves. If you damage this family, if you break my nephew's heart or exploit his grief or prove to be anything less than what you appear, I will make your life extraordinarily difficult. I have 4 decades of social capital, and I am not above spending every penny of it. I understand. I doubt that. But you will. She rang the bell for the butler, signaling the conversation was over. When Ashworth re-entered, his eyes searched Lenora's face with an intensity that suggested he'd spent the last 15 minutes preparing for catastrophe. "Well," he said. Lady Hargrove waved a dismissive hand. "Your fiancé has adequate spine. The rest remains to be seen." She picked up her embroidery, as if the most charged conversation of Lenora's life had been nothing more than a mildly interesting interlude. "The Pemberton Ball is in 10 days. I expect you both to attend. Properly. If you're going to parade this engagement before society, at least do it with some elegance." Outside in the carriage, Ashworth turned to her with something raw in his expression. "What did she say to you?" "She said she spent 40 years choosing control over love, and it cost her everyone she was trying to protect." He was quiet for a long time. "She's never said anything like that to me, not once. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe it was easier to say it to a stranger." The carriage moved through the afternoon streets. Ashworth sat across from her, his dark eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For asking about Meridia. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something shift behind his careful facade, a door opening that he hadn't meant to unlock. He said nothing more. But when the carriage stopped at Colborne House, he offered his hand to help her down, and held it a moment longer than necessary. Just a moment. But enough. The Pemberton Ball arrived like a storm that had been building for days. Lenora could feel it in the house, in the way Dorrit laid out 3 different pairs of gloves before settling on the ivory kidskin, in the way Meridia changed her own gown twice and still wasn't satisfied, in the way Ashworth disappeared into his study all morning and emerged looking like a man preparing for battle rather than a dance. Madame Hartshorn's masterpiece arrived that afternoon, a gown of deep bronze silk that caught the light like liquid metal. The bodice was fitted, the sleeves were delicate cap sleeves edged with copper lace, and the skirt fell in weighted folds that moved like water when Lenora walked. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever worn, and it terrified her. Dorrit arranged her hair in an elaborate sweep, threading thin gold ribbons through the auburn waves. The sapphire ring gleamed on her finger. Small amber earrings, Meridia's, caught the candlelight. "You look like you belong in a painting," Dorrit whispered, stepping back. "I look like I belong in someone else's life," Lenora replied. But she straightened her shoulders and descended to the entrance hall where Ashworth waited. He was in dark, formal evening wear, severe and immaculate, his expression locked behind the careful mask she was learning to read. His eyes swept over her once, then again, then settled on her face with an intensity that made her breath stutter. "You look." He paused. The mask flickered. "That gown is well chosen." From across the hall, Meridia groaned audibly. "For heaven's sake, Ashworth, she looks magnificent. Say it like a human being." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. "You look magnificent, Miss Graves." "Thank you, my lord." Her voice was steady, even if her pulse was not. The Pemberton estate blazed with light. Carriages stretched down the drive in a glittering queue, and the ballroom itself was a cathedral of candles, mirrors, and hothouse flowers that made the air heavy with jasmine and ambition. Lenora had thought the Guildford reception was overwhelming. This was another magnitude entirely. "Steady," Ashworth murmured as they entered. His hand found the small of her back, warm through the bronze silk. You've earned your place here tonight. Remember that. She hadn't earned anything. She'd been purchased, but his voice anchored her, and she lifted her chin and walked beside him as if she'd been doing this her entire life. The first hour was a gauntlet of introductions. Ashworth moved through the crowd with the ease of someone navigating these waters since birth. She met the Duchess of Allerdale, ancient and imperious, who examined her through a lorgnette and pronounced her interesting, which is more than I can say for most of the girls this season. She met Lord and Lady Pemberton, warm and welcoming. She met young officers who flirted harmlessly and society matrons who did not. And then she met Phaedra Ashwell. She was everything Lenora had feared, tall, golden-haired, with the kind of beauty that seemed designed in a workshop. Her ice blue gown was clearly Parisian, and she wore it with the confidence of a woman who had never doubted she was the most striking person in any room. Lord Trevane. Her curtsy to Ashworth was a study in practiced grace. How lovely to see you. And this must be— She let the pause stretch, deliberate and dismissive. Miss Graves. Lady Phaedra. Lenora returned the courtesy. What a beautiful gown. French, isn't it? The embroidery is exquisite. You have an eye for needlework. How charming. The implication was clear. A merchant's daughter would know stitching the way a lady knew music. Tell me, how are you finding London? It must be quite different from— Another loaded pause. Cheapside, was it? Holborn, originally. Though I've lived in several parts of London. One of the advantages of modest means you learn the whole city, not just the fashionable corners. Phaedra's smile tightened. How resourceful. Miss Graves is being modest, Ashworth interjected, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard by the surrounding guests. Her father supplied silk to half the best houses in London. I suspect many of the gowns in this room tonight were made from Graves fabric. It was a masterstroke. Suddenly, Lenora wasn't an interloper. She was a supplier, a connection, someone who had touched this world even from the outside. Several women nearby glanced at their own dresses with sudden interest. Phaedra's composure held, but something hardened behind her eyes. How fascinating. You must tell me more about the trade sometime. I find commerce so educational. She glided away, and Lenora released a breath she'd been holding for what felt like minutes. That was deliberate cruelty, she murmured to Ashworth. That was an opening skirmish. The real assault will come later. His hand pressed more firmly against her back. Are you ready for the waltz? The orchestra struck the first notes, and Ashworth led her onto the floor. His hand settled at her waist. Hers found his shoulder, and they began to move. This was different from anything she'd practiced with the dancing master Meridia had hired. Ashworth led with absolute authority, his body directing hers through the turns and sweeps with a certainty that left no room for doubt. She didn't need to think. She didn't need to count. She only needed to trust his lead and let the music carry them. You're trembling, he said quietly. I'm terrified. Of the dance? Of everything. Of this room and these people, and the fact that I'm wearing a dress that costs more than my family earns in a year. Of how easy it would be to destroy me if anyone in this room discovers the truth. His grip tightened fractionally. No one will discover anything. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise that if it happens, you won't face it alone. His eyes held hers, dark and intense, and she saw something there that wasn't performance, wasn't strategy, wasn't part of the contract. The waltz ended. He released her with formal correctness, bowing over her hand in full view of the ballroom. Thank you, Miss Graves. Thank you, my lord. They were acting. She knew they were acting. So why did her hand feel cold where his had been? The supper dance came later, after 2 hours of circulating, of Lenora answering questions and deflecting probes and smiling until her face ached. Ashworth claimed her again, and this time the conversation was different, quieter, more personal, sliding beneath the social armor. "What would you be doing tonight?" he asked. "If none of this had happened? If you'd never met Hewitt Dalton or walked into that solicitor's office? Mending, probably. Or reading by candlelight, if we could afford the candles. Sometimes I'd sit by the window and watch the carriages pass on the main road and wonder where they were going. And now you're inside the carriage. Now I'm inside someone else's carriage. That's different." Something shifted in his expression. Is it? Or is the only difference who holds the reins? Before she could answer, Meridia appeared at the edge of the dance floor, her face flushed and urgent. "Ashworth. Lenora. You need to come with me now." She led them through a side corridor to a small antechamber. Inside, Lady Hargrove sat in a straight-backed chair. Opposite her stood Phaedra Ashwell and an older woman who could only be her mother, the Countess of Comberford, the same sharp features amplified by 30 years of entitlement. "Ah," the Countess said when Ashworth entered. "The elusive Marquis. How convenient. We were just discussing the rather extraordinary situation with Lady Hargrove." Ashworth's expression went blank, the dangerous kind of blank. "What situation would that be, Lady Comberford?" "The situation in which my daughter was given to understand, by your own aunt, that a match between your families was settled, and now finds herself publicly humiliated by the appearance of a nobody in borrowed silk." "I made no promises to your daughter," Ashworth said, his voice flat as a blade. "If expectations were created, they were created without my knowledge or consent. Lady Hargrove assured us—" "Lady Hargrove," Ashworth cut across, turning to his aunt, "may speak for herself. Did you promise the Comberfords an engagement on my behalf?" Lady Hargrove sat perfectly still. Then she spoke with devastating calm. "I indicated that Ashworth would be amenable to the match. I was mistaken. I overstepped. It will not happen again." It was an admission that cost her dearly. Lenora could see it in the white-knuckled grip of her hands, in the rigid set of her shoulders. Lady Hargrove was publicly conceding defeat, and every person in that room understood the magnitude of it. The Countess of Comberford's face purpled. "This is an outrage." "This is a private family matter," Ashworth said, "and it's concluded. I wish your daughter well, Lady Comberford. She'll make someone an excellent wife. It simply won't be me." He offered Lenora his arm. "Shall we return to the ball?" They walked out of that room together, and Lenora felt something shift between them, something tectonic and irreversible. Lady Hargrove had just chosen her nephew over her own plan. The rival had been dismissed. The battlefield had cleared. And Ashworth's hand on her arm wasn't performing anymore. On the terrace, away from the music and the watching eyes, they stood in cool evening air that smelled of cut grass and distant rain. "She surprised me," Ashworth said quietly. "My aunt. I didn't expect her to concede. She did it for you, not for me. Perhaps." He turned to face her. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, turning him into something from a story. The Dark Lord in the garden, the prince who couldn't say what he meant. Or perhaps she saw something in you that made her reconsider what suitable actually means. "Don't romanticize this, Ashworth. We have a contract." "I'm aware of the contract." His voice dropped. "I'm also aware that contracts don't explain why I spent the entire waltz memorizing the way your eyes look when you're frightened, but pretending not to be." Her breath caught. "That's not—" "Or why I've been sleeping less since you moved into Colborne House. Or why I find excuses to be in whatever room you're occupying. Or why the thought of this ending in 3 months makes me feel like someone is removing the air from the room, slowly and deliberately. Ashworth. My name is Ashworth to everyone, But you, he stepped closer. You could call me by my name if you wanted to. I don't even know your given name. Rhett. He said it like a confession. My mother chose it. No one uses it anymore. Rhett. The name felt intimate on her tongue, private, like holding something fragile. We should go back inside, he said, but didn't move. We should, she agreed, but didn't move either. The space between them narrowed to nothing, and in the shadows of the Pemberton terrace, with the music drifting like smoke through the open doors, the Marquess of Trevane kissed the woman he'd hired to pretend to love him. And there was nothing pretend about it. The days after the Pemberton ball existed in a strange suspension between what was real and what was arrangement. Ashworth, Rhett, did not mention the kiss. Lenora did not mention the kiss. They continued their public performance with practiced ease, attending a garden party at the Allerdale estate and a dinner hosted by Lord Marchbanks, where Lenora charmed the table with a story about her father negotiating a silk shipment from Milan, using nothing but schoolboy Italian and sheer stubbornness. But underneath the performance, everything had changed. The careful distance Ashworth maintained in private had collapsed. He appeared in the library when Lenora was reading, bringing tea he claimed Mrs. Caulfield had made too much of. He asked about her family, real questions, the kind that couldn't be explained by needing background for the charade. Tell me about your mother, he said one evening, settled into the leather chair across from hers while rain streaked the library windows. She's the strongest person I know. When Father lost everything, she didn't cry. Not once. At least, not where we could see. She simply began mending, literally. Took in other people's clothing and repaired it, stitch by stitch, until there was enough money to keep us fed. She made it look natural, as if she'd always intended to spend her evenings hunched over torn petticoats by candlelight. And your father? Broken. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet way that's almost worse. He goes through the motions, eats when food is placed before him, reads when a book is opened in his lap. But the man who built a business from nothing, who could talk anyone into anything, who used to fill our house with laughter, that man left and didn't come back. Ashworth was quiet for a long time. I understand that more than you know. Your father, after my mother died, he was present in body and absent in everything else. He managed the estates with mechanical efficiency. He attended Parliament. He made decisions. But he never remarried, never pursued happiness, never seemed to want anything for himself. I used to think it was devotion. Now I think it was surrender. And you're afraid you're doing the same thing. His hand stilled on the armrest. I'm afraid it runs in the blood. The Colborne men love completely and break permanently. My grandfather was the same after my grandmother died. 3 generations of men who couldn't survive loss. That's not inheritance. That's a choice. Is it? His eyes met hers, and the vulnerability there was staggering. Because I've been choosing control and distance and duty for 7 months, and it was working perfectly well until you appeared in a solicitor's office and started dismantling everything. Lenora's heart hammered. I haven't dismantled anything. You've dismantled me. He said it simply, like stating a fact about the weather. I had a plan. Survive the season, shake off my aunt's matchmaking, keep everyone at a safe distance. And then, you walked in with your gray wool dress and your 15 different ways to say no. And he stopped, ran a hand through his hair. This wasn't supposed to happen. No, Lenora whispered. It wasn't. They looked at each other across the library, the fire crackling between them, and Lenora felt the ground shifting beneath her, the careful architecture of their arrangement crumbling into something far more dangerous and far more real. What happens now? She asked. I don't know. I've never Not known before. I've always had a plan, a strategy, a next move. But with you, he shook his head. With you, I just want to stay in this room and pretend the season never ends. She should have pulled back, should have reminded them both of the contract, the timeline, the inevitable conclusion. Instead, she crossed the space between them, knelt beside his chair, and took his hand. I'm scared too, she said, because wanting something this much gives it the power to destroy you. His hand turned in hers, fingers interlacing. My father's lesson? My father's too. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, gently, reverently, as if she were something sacred rather than something purchased. Stay, he said. Not because of the contract. Not for 30 pounds. Stay because you want to. If I stay for the wrong reasons, stay for any reason. I'll take any reason you'll give me. It was the most unguarded thing he'd ever said. And it was the moment Lenora realized, with the quiet certainty of a door clicking shut, that she was in love with a man she'd been hired to pretend to love. And that the pretending had stopped weeks ago. But love, she'd learned from watching her parents, was not the same as safety. And the higher you climbed in someone else's world, the further you had to fall. The blow came 3 days later, at a luncheon hosted by Lady Sinclair. Lenora was standing near the refreshment table, talking with Meridia about the latest novel they'd been reading together when she heard the whispers. Contract, apparently. Hewitt Dalton arranged it. 30 pounds to play the fiancé for the season. Merchant's daughter with debts. The brother's a gambler. The whole family is one step from the workhouse. And she's wearing his mother's ring. Can you imagine the presumption? The words hit her like ice water. She turned slowly and found Phaedra Ashwell watching from across the room with a smile that was pure satisfaction. Behind her stood a man Lenora recognized with a sickening lurch. Hewitt Dalton, looking simultaneously guilty and defiant. Hewitt had told them, whether for money or revenge, or simply because men like Hewitt couldn't resist proving they knew secrets, he had told Phaedra everything. The room was watching now, the whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Lenora felt the floor tilting beneath her, felt the beautiful bronze architecture of her borrowed life cracking along every fault line. Meridia grabbed her arm. Lenora, don't listen. Whatever they're saying the truth. Lenora's voice came out hollow. That's the problem. The luncheon dissolved into a nightmare of whispered conversations and averted eyes. Lenora stood in the center of it, watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time, and felt a strange, numb clarity descend. This was always going to happen. She'd known it from the moment she signed the contract. The only surprise was that it had taken this long. Ashworth arrived within the hour, summoned by a frantic note from Meridia. He entered the Sinclair drawing room like a thunderclap, his face white with fury, his eyes sweeping the room until they found Hewitt Dalton trying to slip out through a side door. Don't. The single word stopped Hewitt mid-stride. If you leave this room, I will find you, and what happens then will be considerably worse than what happens now. Hewitt turned, his face ashen. My lord, I can explain. You sold information about a private arrangement to the woman, most motivated to weaponize it. There is no explanation that salvages your character. I didn't sell anything. She cornered me, asked questions I couldn't dodge. You could have lied. You could have left. You could have come to me. Ashworth's voice was terrifyingly controlled. Instead, you chose the path that caused maximum damage to the one person in this arrangement who had the most to lose. Get out of my sight. We'll settle accounts later. Hewitt fled. The room was electric with tension, every guest frozen in the peculiar paralysis, of people witnessing something they'd gossip about for months. Ashworth turned to Lenora. Something in his expression cracked when he saw her face. The careful blankness she was holding like a shield, the tears she refused to release. "Come with me," he said quietly. "There's no point." Her voice was remarkably steady. "They know, Ashworth. They all know. The contract, the 30 pounds, all of it. Your aunt was right. This was always going to end in wreckage. It hasn't ended. It has." She pulled the sapphire ring from her finger. The metal was warm from her skin, and removing it felt like tearing away something that had grown into her. She held it out to him. "This belongs to your mother. It shouldn't be part of a transaction." He didn't take it. "I won't accept that." "You have to." Her composure fractured, just slightly, just enough for him to see the devastation underneath. "I can't stay in a room where everyone knows I was purchased. I can't look at these people and pretend I have dignity when they know the price of it. Your dignity was never for sale. It was never part of the arrangement." It was the only thing in the arrangement. She pressed the ring into his hand, closing his fingers around it. "Thank you, Rhett. For everything. For the library and the books, and the way you made me feel like I might actually belong here. But I don't. I never did. Lenora, let me go. Please, if you care about me at all, let me go with whatever grace I have left." She walked out of the Sinclair house with her head high and her hands shaking, and the absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing. The only thing, the necessary thing. Behind her, she heard Meridia calling her name. She didn't turn back. The carriage took her to Colborne House, where she packed with the mechanical efficiency of someone operating on fumes. Dorrit watched with tears streaming silently down her freckled cheeks, but didn't argue. She simply folded clothes alongside her, pressing a small handkerchief into Lenora's hand at the end. "It's got my initials on it," Dorrit said softly. "So you'll remember, someone here thought you were worth every penny of silk, and 10 times more besides." Lenora nearly broke then, but she held. She held because breaking would mean staying, and staying was no longer something she could survive. She wrote 2 letters, one to Meridia. "You are braver and kinder than anyone in your family deserves. Don't let your aunt shrink you back down. The world needs every inch of you." One to Ashworth. "I'm returning the gowns and the ring and everything that was borrowed. I'm keeping the memory of who I was in your house and the knowledge that, for a few weeks, someone looked at me and saw something extraordinary. That's worth more than 30 pounds. Don't look for me. Don't send Hewitt. Let this be clean." LG. She left Colborne House at dusk, carrying one small bag. She had kept nothing except Dorrit's handkerchief and a single amber earring that Meridia had pressed into her hand on her first day, saying, "For luck, though I don't believe in luck, I believe in stubbornness." The hack carriage that took her to Cheapside smelled of damp wool and old tobacco. It was the opposite of everything she'd inhabited for the past month, and it felt like the truth. Home was exactly as she'd left it. The same cramped rooms, the same smell of bread and lye soap, the same water stain on the kitchen ceiling that her mother kept covering with whitewash that never held. Lenora walked through the door and felt the world contract around her like a fist. Her mother took one look at her face and asked nothing, simply pulled her into an embrace that smelled of lavender and mending thread, and held her while Lenora finally broke. She cried for an hour, not gracefully, not quietly, but with the ugly, racking sobs of someone who had been holding together for too long and had finally run out of material. She cried for the library and the bronze dress and the sapphire ring. She cried for Meridia's fierce hugs and Dorrit's shy kindness. She cried for the kiss on the terrace and the confession in the library, and the way Rhett had looked at her, like she was the first real thing in his carefully constructed life. When the tears finally stopped, her mother sat her down at the kitchen table with weak tea and a piece of bread. "Tell me," her mother said. So Lenora told her. Everything. The contract, the 30 pounds, the charade, the aunt, the rival. The way it had all gone wrong and right simultaneously. She told her about Ashworth, Rhett, and the way he carried his grief like a stone he wouldn't put down. She told her about Meridia, about Dorrit, about the library where she'd felt more at home than anywhere in her life. Her mother listened without interruption. When Lenora finished, the silence was heavy with understanding. "You love him?" her mother said. "It wasn't a question. It doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters. He hired me, Mother. The entire foundation of everything between us is a financial transaction. How do I trust that what he feels is real when it began as a business arrangement?" Her mother reached across the table and took her hands. "Your father hired me, you know. Did I ever tell you that?" Lenora blinked. "What?" "He needed someone to keep his books when he first started the business. I was 17, desperate for work, and terrible at arithmetic. He hired me anyway, because he said I had an honest face." Her mother's eyes were soft with memory. "I worked for him for 2 years before he proposed. And when he did, I said exactly what you're thinking now. How can this be real when it started as a transaction? What changed your mind?" "He did. Not with grand gestures or declarations. With consistency. With showing up every day and treating me as his equal, not his employee. With building a life that included me, not as an accessory, but as a partner." Her mother squeezed her hands. "How something begins doesn't determine how it ends, Lenora. People start as strangers every day and end as family. The origin doesn't poison the destination. But the scandal, everyone knows. His reputation, his family, are his to risk, not yours to protect." Lenora stared at the tea growing cold in her cup. Through the thin walls, she could hear the chandler's wife singing off-key. The drip of the water stain, the creak of the building settling into itself. Small sounds. Real sounds. The soundtrack of a life she'd tried to escape and kept being pulled back to. 3 days passed. Lenora scrubbed floors and mended stockings and tried to remember who she'd been before bronze silk and sapphire rings. She couldn't. The person who had lived in these rooms before the solicitor's office was gone, overwritten by someone who'd tasted a different life and couldn't unfeel it. On the 3rd day, Soren came home with news he could barely contain. "He's gone mad," Soren said, dropping into a chair. "The Marquis. Completely, spectacularly mad." "What are you talking about?" "He stood up in his club, White's, Lenora, and told every man in the room that Hewitt Dalton was a traitor and a coward, and that any gentleman who repeated slander about Miss Lenora Graves would answer to him personally. Then he went to the Comberfords' house and informed the Earl that if his daughter continued spreading malicious gossip, the Comberford family's rather extensive gambling debts would become public knowledge." Lenora's stomach dropped. "He didn't." "He did. And then, this is the part you'll really like, he went to Lady Hargrove's house, and according to the servants who overheard it, he told his aunt that she could either support his choices or lose access to him permanently. No negotiations, no compromises. His exact words apparently were, 'I have spent my entire life living according to other people's expectations, and the one time I found something worth defying those expectations for, I let her walk away. That is a mistake I intend to correct.'" The room was very quiet. "He's coming here," Soren said gently. "Tomorrow. He asked me to tell you." "You spoke to him?" "He found me, tracked me down at the Lamb and Flag, bought me dinner, which was extremely awkward, by the way, being bought dinner by a marquess in a public house, and asked me for one thing. What? Permission to try again. He arrived at noon. No carriage, no footman, no display of wealth or status. He walked up the narrow street to the chandler's shop in a plain, dark coat, hatless, and knocked on the door like an ordinary man calling on an ordinary woman. Lenora opened the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He looked terrible. Dark circles beneath his eyes, his hair less than perfectly ordered, a tension in his frame that suggested he hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. But his eyes, when they found hers, were absolutely clear. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. He entered the small parlor and looked around without a trace of judgment. The worn furniture, the threadbare rug, the single window with its view of the alley. He took in everything and dismissed nothing. "Sit down," Lenora said, because she didn't know what else to say. He sat in her father's chair. She sat across from him in her mother's. Between them, on the small table, sat a teapot that didn't match its cups, and a plate of biscuits her mother had stress-baked at dawn. "Before you say anything," Lenora began, "I need you to understand why I left. You left because Hewitt betrayed the arrangement, and you believed the exposure destroyed any possibility of... I left because I was in love with you, and I couldn't tell the difference between what was real and what was purchased." The words tumbled out, raw and unpolished. "Every time you looked at me, every conversation, every moment in the library, I kept asking myself, is this genuine? Or is this a man performing affection because it's part of the plan? And when the secret came out, when everyone knew about the contract, I couldn't bear the thought that you might defend me out of obligation rather than... Lenora." His voice was quiet but absolute. "Stop." She stopped. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it without arguing, which I recognize is a significant challenge for you." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The contract was real. I won't pretend otherwise. I hired you because I needed a shield, and you accepted because you needed money. That's how it started. That's the truth. I know, I'm not finished." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that pinned her to the chair. "What I didn't anticipate, what no contract could have accounted for, was you. Not the performance of you. You. The woman who negotiated with me in a solicitor's office like she was holding a royal flush and not a pair of twos. The woman who looked my aunt in the eye and demanded freedom for a girl she'd known for less than a day. The woman who sat in my library and told me that surrender was a choice, not an inheritance, and made me believe it for the first time in 7 months. His voice roughened. "I fell in love with you somewhere between the Guildford reception and the Pemberton ball. I don't know the exact moment. I don't think it was a moment. I think it was an accumulation. Every conversation, every challenge, every time you refused to be impressed by my title or intimidated by my world. You made me want to deserve the life I'd been given instead of simply enduring it." Lenora's eyes burned. "The scandal will pass. Scandals always pass. Something more interesting will happen next week, and society will forget about us entirely. Your aunt," he conceded, not gracefully. She may never be graceful about it. But genuinely. She told me yesterday that she'd rather have a nephew who chose unwisely and lived fully than one who chose safely and died by inches. I believe those were the kindest words she's spoken in 40 years. And Phaedra has been informed, clearly and publicly, that her behavior was beneath contempt and that any further interference will have consequences she won't enjoy. Her father has already sent an apology. Apparently, the gambling debts were quite motivating. Lenora laughed despite everything. It came out watery and broken and real. I'm not offering you a contract this time, Ashworth said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring. Not the sapphire, but a different one. A simple gold band, set with a single pearl, delicate and luminous. This was my grandmother's, my father's mother. The one who married for love against everyone's advice and was happy for 43 years. Rhett, I'm offering you a choice, Lenora. Not an arrangement, not a bargain, a choice. Stay with me because you want to. Marry me because you love me. Build something real on top of everything that started as pretense. And if you say no, if this isn't what you want, I'll walk out of this room and never trouble you again. She looked at the ring in his hand, at the plain dark coat he'd worn instead of his finery, at the way he sat in her father's chair as if it were the most natural seat in the world. You walked here, she said. I walked here. No carriage, no footman. I didn't want you to see a marquess at your door. I wanted you to see me. She crossed the space between them, took the ring from his hand, held it up to the light from the small window, where it caught the sun and glowed with quiet warmth. My mother told me that how something begins doesn't determine how it ends, she said. I didn't believe her. I thought she was being sentimental. And now? Now, I think she might be the wisest person I know. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Yes, Rhett. Not because of 30 pounds or bronze dresses or sapphire rings. Because you walked here. Because you sat in my father's chair. Because you made me brave enough to want something I was terrified to have. He stood and pulled her into his arms and held her, not with the careful formality of a marquess, but with the desperate tenderness of a man who had been drowning and had finally reached solid ground. When they pulled apart, her mother was standing in the doorway, crying silently, and her father, her quiet, broken father, was standing behind her with an expression Lenora hadn't seen in 3 years. He was smiling. 8 months later, on a cold December evening, Lenora stood in the library of Colborne House, her library now, filled with her books alongside his father's collection, and found a letter. It was tucked inside a volume of Keats that had belonged to Ashworth's father, a slim envelope addressed in a careful hand that she recognized from the marginalia scattered throughout the collection. She opened it with gentle fingers. My dear boy, the letter began. I am writing this knowing I may never send it, and knowing equally that someday you may need to read it. Your mother was the great unexpected gift of my life. I was supposed to marry sensibly. Your grandmother had a list of candidates as long as my arm, each one more suitable than the last. Instead, I fell in love with a woman who argued with me about philosophy and laughed too loudly at dinner parties, and once threw a book at my head when I was being insufferably pompous. Your Aunt Hargrove called it a disaster. Your grandmother called it a miracle. They were both right. Love is always both. I know that when I am gone, you will retreat. You are my son, and retreating is what Colborne men do when the world becomes too sharp. You will bury yourself in duty and call it living. You will build walls and call them strength. And your aunt will encourage every brick because she believes, as I once did, that control is the same as safety. It isn't. Control is the absence of risk, and the absence of risk is the absence of joy. Your mother taught me that. Every day I had with her was a risk. The risk of loving someone so completely that their absence would break me. And it did break me. Losing her broke something that never fully healed. But I would not trade a single day. Not one. The breaking was the price of the joy, and the joy was worth every fracture. Find someone who argues with you, my son. Someone who throws books and negotiates in solicitors' offices and refuses to be impressed by your title. Find someone who makes you brave enough to risk breaking again. And then hold on to her with everything you have. The estates will endure, the title will pass on. But love is the only thing you take with you, and the only thing worth leaving behind. With all my heart, your father. Lenora read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down in the leather chair by the fire, Rhett's chair, now also hers, and held the pages to her chest and cried the kind of tears that are not grief, but gratitude. She was still there when Rhett found her. "What's this?" He crossed the room and saw the letter. His face went still. "Where did you find it?" "In the Keats. He must have tucked it away years ago." Ashworth took the letter and read it standing, his back to the fire, his face doing something complicated and raw that he would never have allowed anyone but her to see. When he finished, he pressed the pages against his mouth and closed his eyes. "He knew," he said hoarsely. "He knew exactly what I'd become. He knew exactly what you'd overcome." Lenora stood and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his chest. "He just wanted you to have permission." "Permission to what?" "To be happy, even though it's terrifying, even though it's a risk." He held her for a long time. The fire crackled. Snow had begun to fall outside the library windows, dusting the garden in white. "I want to frame this," he said finally. "Hang it in here, where we can see it every day." Your father would have hated that. He'd have wanted it left in a book where someone could stumble across it unexpectedly, like a gift you didn't know you needed. Rhett laughed, the real laugh, the one she'd first heard in the solicitor's office, startled out of him against his will. "You're right. He would have." He tucked the letter back into the Keats and returned it to the shelf. "We'll leave it where it is, for whoever needs it next." They stood together in the library, surrounded by books and firelight, and the quiet ghosts of the people who had loved before them. Outside, London carried on, its gossip and scandals and endless social machinery grinding forward as it always did. The whispers about the Marquis and his merchant's bride had mostly faded, replaced by fresher scandals involving a bishop and a racehorse, which was far more entertaining. Lady Hargrove had taken to introducing Lenora at social events with the phrase, "My nephew's wife. She has opinions." This was delivered with a tartness that Lenora recognized as the highest form of affection Lady Hargrove was capable of producing. Meridia had made her debut and was being courted by 3 young men, none of whom met Lady Hargrove's standards, but all of whom met Meridia's, which was the only criteria that mattered now. Dorrit had been promoted to head lady's maid. She still brought tea without being asked. Soren had found work, legitimate work, managing accounts for a textile firm, a position secured through a reference that bore the Colborne seal. He was, against all odds, proving reliable. Their mother wrote that she barely recognized him, and Hewitt Dalton had disappeared to the continent, which was probably for the best. Every year, on the anniversary of the day Lenora had walked into a solicitor's office and agreed to sell 3 months of her life for £30, she and Rhett returned to that same office. It had been converted into a bookshop, which they both considered a significant improvement. They would browse the shelves for an hour, selecting 1 book each, and walk home together through whatever weather London offered. It was their tradition, their reminder, their proof that sometimes the best things in life begin as transactions and end as something money could never buy. Thank you for being here. You are the reason these stories exist, because you believe in love that risks everything for something real, in characters who fight for happiness even when the odds are stacked against them, in endings that feel earned and true. Your presence makes this space warm and welcoming, and I'm grateful for every moment you spend with these characters. Do you have a favorite line or scene? Your engagement helps me understand what moves you, what keeps you listening, and what kinds of stories to create next. Consider subscribing if you'd like more romances with emotional depth and genuine character growth. Thank you for being here. You make this community what it is.